Howdy y'all, my name is Jon Sturman. Greetings from Hong Kong. Professor Morrow has given us an opportunity to go over some of the articles that was used by the author of our chapters. So Professor Law had about close to 24 articles that he chose, and I dug in and I think I chose 4 that he actually used for the chapter. And then I went on to try to find one that was an article that he didn't use. This is a great opportunity for us to explore some of the topics that we just didn't have time to go over the first time, and we can try to dig a little deeper into the issues. The first article that I chose to run with was a journal article on the Hong Kong movement, or the Occupy movement, by Samson Ewan, and this article focused on the aftermath and his thoughts on the aftermath. Now, Ian and I think a couple others had some questions revolving around Hong Kong and its status with regards to its relationship with China. So why don't we start there? Ian had hit the nail on the head that Hong Kong had been handed over by the British. The British had ruled Hong Kong for many, many years. And in 1997, they handed Hong Kong back to China. However, Hong Kong, which was pretty much governed by British rules, government, and law, was somewhat left to its own devices. And they came up with a one country, two systems policy where Hong Kong had been given back to China and belonged to China. However, China let Hong Kong continue to run its government, its markets, the laws, somewhat under the British rule. And the plan is for China to completely put Hong Kong under a one country system by 2047. So I think a lot of the concerns of the Occupy movement is kind of this unknown of what will actually happen to Hong Kong by the year 2047, when it should completely be enveloped by China. So what's happened, or where do we stand? Basically, it kind of started, the headline of it all is that, a student-led protest against or fighting for the right to vote, fighting for democracy, and basically they barricaded themselves and shut down half the city for almost a 3-month period. Now, on paper, one would say that it was just for the right for them, like I said, once again, to get the free vote, have a democratic vote, because right now the way it works is they do get to vote for the government and the leaders to come in, but it is based on leaders that are chosen by the Chinese Communist Party. So these individuals are usually extremely wealthy, affluent, and have heavy ties to China, and their allegiances lie solely with the Chinese government and not with the actual Hong Kong people. When you speak with regards to the education curriculum, which is one of the major points that the students are fighting for, you can start to see the mainland machine slowly coming down into Hong Kong and starting to affect with everything from the education curriculum. You guys might have read in the papers about how certain booksellers that might promote controversial books or with opinions that are negative toward the Communist Party or to the Chinese government. You might have read about those particular booksellers disappearing for a considerable amount of time, being captured by Chinese agents, taken over to the border, and then miraculously reappearing a few months later. You can see in the curriculum that the Chinese government is trying to force the Cantonese language out of the classroom, and they want to see more Mandarin in the classroom. And just a number of things, well beyond the actual right to vote for leaders that are chosen by the Hong Kong people themselves. Now, it's quite timely, but the South China Morning Post came this morning, Saturday, November 19, 2016, and there was an article actually on the front page talking about city faces tougher love from Beijing, expect more of one country focus in Hong Kong policy and appreciate all the preferential treatment, mainland defense expert advises. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but you can get an idea and a sense of how important this particular topic is for Hong Kong right now. The future of Hong Kong and the student-led protest didn't end once the Occupy movement was finally disbanded after 3 months and the city was opened back up. They continued to fight. There was a recent election where a number of the students were voted in. I voted for them, and they actually are in a fight right now of whether or not they'll take the oath that they're supposed to take with allegiances to China, and whether or not they'll actually be let into the government itself. But this article, I'll just give you guys a couple of paragraphs of it, but it talks about how Beijing has shown enough tolerance and special preference for Hong Kong, and the city should not expect anything better than it has already been granted. An influential mainland defense researcher said yesterday, likening the political turmoil in Hong Kong over independence advocacy to China's Cultural Revolution, Jen Yenin told a group of local journalists that Beijing would now focus even more on one country instead of two systems, a policy track it began 5 years ago when Hong Kong was embroiled in a row over national education. Jen said he had been struck back then by the huge backlash against the government's bid to introduce the subject into the school curriculum. So, like I said, the movement itself was much larger than just getting to vote for your officials. It really is about what's going to happen to Hong Kong as it heads to that 2047 period. And we're talking, if they are enveloped by Hong Kong and they're not left with a one country, two system policy, will the internet continue to be free? You go to China right now, as I mentioned before, there's no mention of Tiananmen Square. Basically, it's been wiped from the history pages. It doesn't exist. They host, a massive candlelight vigil every year with respect to what happened at Tiananmen Square. Will you have the freedom of press? Will there be a South China Morning Post? Will there be, freedom of press? Will they be able to say what they want and publish such articles that might be negative toward the Communist Party or to the Chinese government? We don't know. But this is what this student-led protest is all about, and this is what the umbrella movement and Occupy Hong Kong, this is how it all started. It's far from over, and it is something that will be absolutely fascinating to watch how it develops headed into that 2047 handover. The next article that I thought was interesting was an article by Susan Brownell, and it's an article with respect to the Olympics in China entitled, "Will the Olympics Change China, or Will China Change the Olympics?" We spoke briefly on this. I'm a firm believer that the Olympics had a tremendous impact with regard to many of the locals, volunteers, and Chinese around major cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and even Hong Kong to some extent, forcing them to take a better understanding of the English language. And I think, as you headed up into 2008, I had told you guys that it was fairly difficult to get around the mainland without a native speaker or without someone with you that had some understanding of conversational Mandarin. And if you didn't, you really were relying on your hotel, the guest reception and the concierge to try to get you from point A to B. But and this article does talk a little bit about that. But what I wanted to focus on in this article that I found was interesting, and it's something that we didn't really get to talk about much due to time in the presentation, is this idea of feng shui. And in the Chinese culture, both in the mainland and in Hong Kong, many people's lives, day-to-day lives, and much of their world rely around this concept of feng shui, which is a bit of a mixture of mysticism, superstition, auspicious dates. It's kind of how your environment and the world around you mixes in with your chi, your inner life force, as they say, and how it really rules the day-to-day beliefs and the strategies and how they plan. I can't tell you how many local friends I have that have to actually go to a feng shui master, which will help them use astronomy, use the calendar, use the Chinese calendar to find themselves an auspicious date, a lucky date per se, to get married, a date that will bring them much luck in their marriage, with their children, with their wealth, with their career. You have to realize, how much the Chinese and the locals believe in luck. And in Macau, which is a Portuguese colony for many years, but now has been handed also back to China, some of the biggest casinos in the world. In fact, much of the casinos back home, like Las Vegas Sands, or when much of their wealth and their stock price is actually driven by the sister casinos that reside in Macau. Unbelievable amounts of money flow through there. We have two major horse tracks in Hong Kong, if you can believe that. One is actually in Causeway Bay, which is about a 10-minute cab ride from where I work, in the middle of the city, which is an amazing place to go if you ever get a chance. They run every Wednesday night, and then they run up in Sha Tin, up in the new territories, which is closer to the Chinese border. They run the ponies on Sundays, and the amount of money that is gambled on a Sunday or Wednesday, the U.S., when you think of like Kentucky Derby, Belmont, and the Preakness, pale in comparison to the amount of money that moves through the horses on a Wednesday or Sunday. So Susan goes on to talk about how the opening ceremonies of the Beijing Olympics took place on 8/8/2008. The number 8 is arguably the luckiest number in the Chinese world. And she talks about how the pronunciation for the word 8 or ba sounds like the word fa, which is the first character in the words of fazan, development, and fakai, to become wealthy. And these two words had defined China's effort to modernize in the last century, and the main elements of the dream that is referred to in the slogan, One World, One Dream, which they used for the Olympics. I can't even begin to describe how this lucky number 8, works into Chinese culture in terms of how lucky they think it is. I actually just went to a wedding in October in San Francisco. I was on a business trip back, and the two families had met with a feng shui master, and they picked October 8th on a Saturday to get married. And I was going to share with you guys a really fascinating story. As the Chinese over the last decade have become more affluent, they have in many ways wanted to show their wealth. They do it a number of ways. Sometimes it might be, a Louis Vuitton bag or a Prada bag. They're really into their watches. They love a good Daytona Rolex, Panerai, a Patek. And one of the reasons that we talked about this, the Bordeaux prices have shot up, is based on the consumption of the Chinese coming into that market. India has also helped, and especially on the whiskey front, but in terms of the Burgundies and the Bordeaux, the first growth wines. Now, 2008 was one of the toughest years for Bordeaux. In fact, the futures were really depressed, and the wine merchants were having a tough time selling the wine because when they went to harvest the grapes, it was an extremely wet season. And as they went to harvest, many of the grapes were already moldy. So a lot of the wines, especially the second growth and the guys that don't have quite the expertise as the first growth producers, were struggling to produce wine that didn't smell moldy, kind of had when you'd pop the bottle, have a gym sock, moldy smell to it, and a little bit of a mildew taste. But there were some pretty savvy wine merchants that didn't give up, especially on some of the first growth. And they were able to buy these wines on pennies on the dollar and tuck them away. And sure enough, as the Chinese have become extremely wealthy, as some of their companies have grown and they brought them to market and IPO'd and became billionaires overnight, like a Jack Ma of Alibaba, they wanted to show off their wealth at these galas or events they would host, weddings, 100-year or 100-day birthday parties that they have for their babies. And how do you do that? You show it off with wine, with the first growth Bordeaux's. So what number did they want to go after? They went after the 2008, and these wine merchants that had bought this wine for pennies on the dollar were able to resell it to some of these affluent Chinese, and the margins were huge. They crushed it. So it just shows you how much this 2000, or not the 2000, but the number 8 plays into the Chinese culture and this whole idea of feng shui, and how they interpret their environment and the world around them, how that plays into their lives. Another interesting point is that they actually will take a look at a room, and they will set up furniture in a certain way. They may bring in green plants. They may bring in water, so they may bring in aquariums. When you leave the elevator bank, there's actually a door to your right, a set of doors to your left. Then when you go into those set of doors, you will actually be blocked by a giant fish tank, an aquarium full of fish. And then if you were to get past that aquarium, you'll see rows of desks, but then that will get you to the windows. They actually call that in the feng shui world triple doors of death. It's extremely unlucky. So that's why the fish tank is there, to actually hopefully harmonize the environment, protect the chi or the life force of the trading floor, hopefully bringing in some luck and some wealth, and actually protecting the traders that sit in that line of the triple doors of death, hopefully protecting them from unlucky bad vibes. So it's a very interesting concept. I think it's something that you could definitely read up on. It's fascinating. It really rules the day-to-day life for many mainland Chinese in local Hong Kong. And Susan Brownell did a good write-up how it also, the Beijing Olympics, feng shui was heavily used in terms of how they organized everything from the start date, which we talked about, to how they organized the Olympic Village, the games, where the swimming, diving tracks would be built and where it would be hosted. Last topic that I'd like to focus on was a article entitled "Bringing China's Best and Brightest Back Home: Regional Disparities and Political Tensions" by Chang Li. 2 points that I think Professor Law did a pretty good job of talking about in the chapter were the brain drain, and the other is the focus by the government to try to get some top universities or try to get the mainland universities into a top 25 global ranking. So Cheng did a good job of kind of highlighting this as well, and talking about some of the steps that the Chinese government, with regards to education curriculum and with regards to trying to get their students that go abroad to come home and to work toward building better universities and a better education platform. One of the major problems for China is with so many of its students trying to go abroad, many of them don't return. And this was a major problem, especially during the Cultural Revolution in the 80s, which is a pretty dark time for China, and kind of persisted into the 1990s. Now, into the 1990s, they started to take steps to try to lure some of these academics and scholars to come back, and that has progressed into the 2000s, and they have had some successes. One of the suggestions by Cheng is that the government had started to offer grants, usually in the form of 6 to 12 months. So, kind of giving that window of time to the academic to go abroad and to, get a chance to go do some research and study and spread their wings and fly. But, at the end of the 6 to 12 months, that money would run out, and that was with the hope that they would come home with the skill set and use those skills to teach, students in the mainland. The other thing that I think, has worked, I've seen it in Hong Kong, and I've seen it in a couple of cities globally, is this idea of, universities like Northwestern Kellogg, University of Chicago, even Texas A&M, trying to improve their global brand. And you're starting to see some of these countries and cities bid for these universities to come and open its doors in their countries. So, for instance, in Hong Kong, you could actually go get an executive MBA while in Hong Kong from Northwestern Kellogg, which is one of the best MBA programs in the world. Just down the road from us in Po Phalam, University of Chicago has taken down a plot of land and is currently building a campus there. What particular programs they're going to offer, I don't know, but the University of Chicago is one of the best economic school with some of the brightest minds in the world. And you've even seen Texas A&M now has a campus in Qatar. So this is not something that's new, but, I would argue that, if China really, does want to get its universities into the global top 25, and you're struggling to do so organically, then why not just open up your pockets and go buy one? The other idea that I had that might work for China, kind of on the back of this, in terms of, brain drain and the hurdle of trying to get their universities in the top 25. I mentioned to you guys in a discussion, but I was in Chicago on a trip recently, and I happened to turn on 60 Minutes, which did a fantastic piece on artificial intelligence. I actually, put it into one of the discussions for you guys. If you didn't have a chance to watch it, I really recommend you do so. It was fascinating. But, IBM's Watson supercomputer is now being used by universities, especially in the medical world, to complement the doctors, helping them, cover medical journals. I think it can read like 8,000 a day, which no human being on the planet could even attempt to do. Helping them give, guidance on what kind of treatments that should be used for different patients. So that could be an option maybe for China. They could bring in some type of computer like a Watson, and that could be there to complement the universities and the academics that they currently have, and maybe the academics could learn from this computer and that could hopefully help them boost themselves into taking them to the next level to get into the top 25 global ranking. I think the problem that China is having, and it stems back to the Cultural Revolution. We talked about this when Mao took over, and it was this dark time in history when most of the academics, musicians, artists, doctors, lawyers all left for Taiwan. But China is still struggling to produce students that have a sense of creative thinking, creative learning. I think they're excellent at the plug and play when they have the variables and it goes into an equation. But as we talked about, life is not an equation. It's fluid, it's dynamic, and things change. So you have to be able to think on your feet. China is still struggling with producing that Apple iPhone. The Koreans, they're struggling to produce that car of the year, Hyundai Elantra, or something like an electric Tesla. You could argue that they have unbelievable, and they become very affluent. They have some very savvy businessmen. Jack Ma has built Alibaba. He became a billionaire overnight. But when you look at Alibaba, it's effectively just a big Amazon. So, like I said, very good at replicating technology, very good at copying technology, but struggling to kind of come up with that fresh idea. And I'd mentioned to you guys when I do interviews for the interns, and they have studied and come from mainland China, a lot of times they can struggle during the interview when you ask them questions that aren't the typical investment banking questions that they probably studied in a book or were told that I was going to ask at a peer review session. So all pretty interesting. Those are the 3 articles that out of the 5 that I think you guys would find most interesting. Those are probably the 3 topics that we kind of maybe briefly touched on during the PowerPoint presentation, but didn't really get to delve deeper into. I hope you guys find those topics interesting. If you have any questions regarding some of those topics, I can point you guys in directions of where to find more information about them. And I hope you guys all have a good weekend.